Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here today with my colleagues Josh Mickle and Terry Basel. They're both extension agronomists for Northeast and North Central Iowa, along with my dairy colleague Fred Hall out in Northwest Iowa, as we discuss today's timely topic, discussing how we're handling and harvesting those storm damaged crops that we encountered here in the last few weeks. So welcome to our podcast, Josh, Terry, and Fred.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Jen. Good to be here.
Good to be here, Jen.
So Josh and Terry, this past week, you've been hosting some crop storm damage meetings to provide information on best practices for dealing with storm damaged crops that we received here in Northeast Iowa. And a lot of what I, was hearing was some good lessons learned from Derecho last year, although we didn't, necessarily want to have to experience that. I think a lot of those lessons that we learned we're bringing back here to Northeast Iowa here in the last few weeks. So as you've assessed the damage and talked with producers, what is the difference or maybe some of the similar damages that you've seen this year versus last year's derecho?
Well, Jen, as far as the damage that we saw that was incurred in the last few weeks, the damage itself to the crops is pretty similar to last year's derecho on August 10th. We've got a combination of probably 3 different scenarios that are occurring a lot of times all in the same field. So like the first scenario is we've got a corn plant or a combination of corn plants that are slightly leaning 45 degrees or so. They're not, down close to the ground. And those plants should do pretty well yet because the roots and everything are still in the soil. And so it's able to pull up the food and the nutrients and the water and to be able to translocate that to the ear and the kernels. So as far as that goes, everything is going accordingly to the way it should be. Those plants should reach black layer and accumulate dry matter accumulation as normal. So as far as yield for those should be, in pretty good shape. And then we take a look at kind of like the 180 of that, where we've got stalks that are severely pinched below the ear or severed below the ear, things like that. And for the most part, that plant is pretty much done. There's not a whole lot of further dry matter accumulation that's going to happen. It's going to be where that plant was at the time that it got damaged. And then we've got the plant that's kind of right in the middle, right? You still have the stalk is pinched some, but yet there's still enough room for that stalk to get translocation going. It's still attached to the soil. The roots are in the ground. And so we still got good nutrient and water movement through that plant, to the ear, to the kernels. It's going to be compromised a little bit where it's not going to be like that first scenario we talked about, but we're still going to be able to get, a fairly decent ear from that, pretty good test weight. It's going to be compromised a little bit, but we're still going to, be pretty good with that as well. Stage development is a little bit different, or stage of development is going to be a little different this year compared to last year. Last year, we were in R4 roughly for the corn that got hit, or dough stage. And this year was primarily R5 or dent. With milk line progression at about a quarter to about a third progression. So when you compare this year to last year, we're actually in a better scenario this year because that's going to help us. We're further along, and that's due to the weather. We had a warmer year this year compared to last year, although we were only a week, roughly a week later from last year. Developmental wise, we were about 2 weeks ahead of that. So which really helped in our corn plant development stage. Because of that, that's going to help us for better yield stability. We have more dry matter accumulation that's occurred within that kernel compared to last year. And so that's going to help with better test weight and ultimately yield out there in the field. Another thing is that the soybeans were damaged just a little bit different this year. Last year, we didn't see as much leaning with the soybeans. With the derecho, most of the strong winds were on the upper level, whereas this year we did see some soybeans that were leaning pretty good after the storms.
Because the crop was more mature, how is that going to affect our silage, fermentation, and the quality of silage?
For the producers that are still out there, still in the process of getting silage or thinking about going after silage now that we have some down corn, there are a few key things that we do need to keep in mind. Your target moisture percent should still be in that 60 to 65% moisture range. Picking up that silage, using that as an option is probably going to be the best way to pick up most of the down corn that is out there and harvest it before the ears and stalks continue to degrade. We may have some, abnormal moisture contents and you're probably not used to, if you would have been chopping a few weeks earlier. So there are some things you're gonna have to think about there. Also, we need to be pretty aware of any potential ear rots, molds that we might have out there as well, just because that corn is substantially lower down at the ground. The airflow isn't going to be nearly as good as you're used to. We may also have some higher than normal nitrate levels. So normally if we have concerns about nitrate levels, we can raise that cutting bar up, to 12 inches or even 18 inches to try to get less nitrates in that silage. But unfortunately, in this situation, we're trying to pick those corn stalks up off the ground. We're probably going to get more of the lower part of that corn plant into the silage. So naturally, we may have some higher nitrate levels that we're not used to. The biggest thing is really just allowing enough time for fermentation to take place. And I would strongly suggest at least 3 to 4 weeks to allow that to properly happen. During fermentation, usually we can decrease our nitrate levels by a third up to a half. The biggest thing is just making sure that we can allow enough time for that to happen. Those are going to be the big issues that we probably need to worry about right now with chopping silage, Fred.
And Josh, just looking in the fields around my area, there's quite a bit of variability even within the fields between damaged corn that's still standing, and just, getting in and out of those fields. There's probably fields out there that just are deemed unharvestable at this point. Can you walk us through some of those options for producers, what they might do with those types of fields?
You're absolutely right, Jen. The word for the meetings that we put on was definitely variability. Every field, there is some variability out there on what is harvestable, what's not. And unfortunately, there may be some fields that can't be harvested, even, with the different options that a farmer may have at their disposal. So there's a few different considerations we need to focus on for fields that we can't harvest. The biggest thing is going to be trying to size that residue down small enough and trying to break up those ears in order to basically produce as much shelled corn out there in the fields that we can. The idea is we want to try to encourage as much fall germination for those corn kernels as possible. Now, there's a few different options that we have to try to make this happen, and it's going to depend quite a bit on what equipment is available to that farmer or in the nearby neighborhood. So disking, vertical tillage, or stalk shredding, or maybe it's a combination of all three of those. But again, the idea is to try to reduce the size of that residue, speed up decomposition, and encourage some of that corn grain to germinate this fall. The more that germinates this fall and winter kills means less volunteer corn that we may have to deal with in the spring. For the fields that are especially down, where we have very flat corn across the field, you may have to go perpendicular against the stalks to try to cut them up. Wavy coulter blades seemed to work very well last year in the Derecho fields. And again, the idea is we don't need to go very deep. The idea isn't to bury everything. We want to try to maintain some good, proper residue on that soil surface to help protect it against erosion. But we also want to try to encourage germination to occur as well. Some other options that we need to think about for fields that can't be harvested, if you're still thinking about putting a cover crop out there, and cover crops can be a great added forage tool for dairy and beef producers alike. How you want to go about putting that cover crop out there is going to depend on how fine you can size that residue, how much soil surface is exposed. Obviously, the more you have, the better it's going to work if you're doing something like a broadcast application. But if you don't have that much soil exposed to the surface, then you might be more limited to applications such as a no-till drill trying to get that cover crop established. No matter what direction you want to go with cover crops, still want to make sure that you have some good rain in the forecast. That's probably the one thing, is making sure that that cover crop doesn't sit dry, and that we have some good moisture in the field, and you have some moisture coming in the forecast as well.
Gentlemen, we've kind of covered the corn silage. Eventually, we're going to move into harvesting the high moisture corn. Are there other things we need to be looking for as we make that transition?
To begin with, we want to kind of target that high moisture corn starting at about 30% moisture out there in the field. And for those that have not done something like that, we're going to be needing to do some different combine adjustments than when we're usually out there harvesting it at 15% or so. A good idea might be to talk to your implement dealership, and they can give some good tips on equipment adjustments. We also have a piece on the ICM website in our storm damage articles and such that kind of talks a little bit about that, as far as some adjustments to consider for your combine. Can you think of anything else to go with that, Josh?
Probably one of the other things to keep in mind when you're harvesting with a combine is you're going to want to take your time. Unfortunately, it's going to be a very slow harvest, but the slower you can use that machine, the better off you're going to be at trying to limit the amount of infield yield losses that you're going to get, just because our stock integrity is very low, our ear integrity might be low. There's a lot of variability in those fields where you have flat corn, you have tangled up corn, and the slower you can go, the better off you're going to be at trying to get as much corn into the head, into the machine. That's unfortunately how a lot of this harvest may go for many of our fields.
I say patience is key.
And Terry, I want to go back to just the residue in the fields, because I think it was brought up at the meeting, wondering the impact of that volunteer corn on next year's crop. We discussed some research that was out there talking about the impact for, next year's crop if there is some volunteer corn out there. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. As we kind of mentioned earlier, the storm affected corn was at R5 or dent, which means pretty much all those kernels are viable for germination. So when you think of that, that's quite a bit of corn that has the potential to be a challenge for us in the next year or so. So as Josh was talking about sizing residue and chopping it with a good tillage tool, that also helps very, very much for getting the volunteer corn that would be on the ears chopped up really well, distributed as consistently and evenly as possible as we can in that top surface, top 6 inches of soil, so that hopefully we can get as much of that to germinate here before winter. So we get a good share of that population to be controlled before next season. Another thing to think of is, what are you going to plant next year? Well, if we could all possibly have a choice, the most preferred crop next year would be soybeans, because we have the best options for control for that. We have many post-emerge grass herbicides that do a very good job on controlling volunteer corn. And we're probably looking at more than one application. We're going to be looking at multiple applications. And learning from the Derecho last year, there's growers down there that are still concerned about it the second year. So going into next year down there for some stuff. They did a study, kind of a quick and dirty study, as far as the viability of volunteer corn last fall. So they took a look at some fields that had received multiple tillage passes in August and early September. And then they went back out there and took square foot samples of the soil. So they dug down about 6 inches in a square foot. and then they counted the number of intact corn seeds that were still there. And it averaged roughly 31 seeds per square foot, and that equates to over 1 million seeds per acre. And so as they were taking a look at those seeds, about 2/3 of those seeds were decayed to the point or damaged to the point where they weren't going to be viable for germination. However, there still was 1/3 of those seeds that equated to being able to be viable and germinating for the next growing season. So huge amount of volunteer corn population can be a great challenge for the next year. In the field, there were large numbers of partial corn ears, average of 15,000 per acre on the soil surface. That's the biggest concern because the ears, the kernels that are still attached to the ear, they're more protected. So they're probably a better chance of them being able to survive through the winter and germinating the following year. So that's why we talk about, as much as possible, get those cobs destroyed, shattered, worked in so that the seeds are sloughed off of that ear, so they're evenly distributed in the soil profile for the better potential of degradation, from that point forward through next season.
We covered a lot of good recommendations here today. It was a pleasure to visit with you, and we will include your contact information with the podcast notes if people want to visit with you about specific questions. Any last thoughts for our listeners as we close the program?
Yeah, Fred, I think maybe just a reminder for folks as they're out there and they're looking at the challenges that are in front of them. People do need to realize that this is probably going to be a little stressful, and they need to remember to take their time as they're going through with this harvest. Harvest is going to be slow and frustrating. Your most damaged fields should be your highest priority. Unfortunately, the stock integrity, the ear integrity isn't going to get better. It's only going to get worse. So we want to try to make sure that, the most damaged fields are the first ones we try to get to before they continue to get worse. But the key is going to be taking it slow, taking frequent breaks. No crop is worth, injuring yourself. If people do have any more comments and questions or would like more information following up from the area-wide meetings that Terry and I put on, or if they just have more general questions about some recommendations, there's a lot of really good information out there that Terry mentioned earlier on our on the ISU website under Extension and Outreach. The crops team has an integrated crop management site, and there's a very large list of storm damage resources that are available on that website. People have questions about those resources or they can't seem to find it. They can also reach out to their local county extension office, and those staff and personnel are more than willing to help them out. And if they have specific questions, they can also reach out to their field specialists through their county office as well.
I would just mention that kind of talked about grain quality is going to possibly be an issue due to the compromised grain quality that's out there. So this grain is probably not going to store as long or as well as easily as a normal crop would. So growers may want to be considering to try to get that off the farm as soon as possible, or to be able to keep it off the farm and hopefully get it to a commercial elevator as soon as they could.
And Terry and Josh, I know we didn't go into real detail about molds and mycotoxins today, just as a reminder that, you're talking about ear rot and that potential for mold could potentially become mycotoxins in some of our feedstuffs for our dairy cattle. And that could have detrimental side effects to our cows, metabolically, reproductively. See some depressed feed intake, low milk production, things like that. And so just, making sure we're working closely with our nutritionist as we open up those bunkers and bags and make sure we're testing that feed routinely so we know at what levels we're dealing with if we see some issues arise with our dairy cattle too. Yeah, Josh or Terry, did you have any other comments on the molds or mycotoxins?
If our weather ends up being cool and wet, then we're probably looking at gibberella that could develop out there in the field. If it gets to be a little bit warmer and wet, then we're looking at fusarium, ear rot. And depending upon the environmental conditions and how they change, we could very easily have both of those out there. If we could wave a magic wand out there, we would want it to be cool and dry, very, very similar to what last week was like for us.
Well, we want to thank you both and Fred for being on the podcast here today. We really hope everyone has a safe and healthy fall harvest and implement some of these practices and recommendations. If you need further information, feel free to reach out to any one of us. We can help you get to the resources. And again, thanks for joining us today and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.